Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 5th of August 2015, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host today, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio behind the technical desk is Mike Robinson. And the weather, well, I think we'll stop reporting the weather fairly shortly because it's been pretty gloomy and misty in Plymouth, although the sun's come out now. We've got reports of cloudy in Glasgow, so if you're north of the border you'll probably be quite happy with that because it's not raining, and remarkably it's dry in the Rhondda. So there you are, that's the weather. Remember, it is still summer 2015, clearly one to be remembered. Well, what's happening at home? A smokescreen of truth, lies, cover-up, obfuscation on the subject of child abuse at high levels in the British government, but some quite remarkable information finally coming out in the mainstream press and media. We think this is an important subject. Indeed, we think it is the most important subject, because if the British public can fully grasp what has been happening in Parliament and the nature of the very people who've been ruling and governing us, we can start to understand the impact of other policies. So let's start with a black and white photograph of Mr. Jimmy Savile with Ted Heath. And of course, they're obviously having a good chuckle here. And what has the Daily Mail got to say? Well, according to the Daily Mail, five police forces reveal that they are investigating abuse claims against the former Prime Minister, Edward Heath. And apparently more victims have come forward. Interesting language straight away by the Mail, because the police have revealed, it's a sort of secret that's had to be levered out, but now apparently they've revealed. This is not the police fully briefing the public who they supposedly serve, but no, they've decided to reveal what's happening. And let's have a look at some of the detail of that Mail article. Well, apparently it emerged that a convicted brothel keeper known as Madam Ling is at the centre of claims of a police cover-up. This is because we're told that she gave police information years ago, of course, and the case was squashed. A former rent boy claims Edward Heath, we'll just call him Heath, I think, raped him, aged 12, at a flat in Mayfair in 1961. Scotland Yard confirmed it had been investigating Heath for months, and a former CPS chief said he had no knowledge of a cover-up or any child abuse claims involving Sir Edward Heath. So quite remarkable stories there. It's the mixture of substance and non-substance, but how remarkable that somebody in the Crown Prosecution Service should say, well, absolutely no knowledge of a cover-up or any child abuse claims involving Sir Edward Heath, because as we're going to see in a minute, other papers have been saying that it was all over the internet. Friends of the politician claimed he was the victim of a smear campaign and predicted he would be vindicated on all the allegations. So the same language that has been used around Leon Britton as just one example, and indeed with Jimmy Savile in the early days, when people were saying, well, of course, this is all complete nonsense and what a wonderful man. Well, they experienced a deep shock for the family of Leon Britton, and I think there's going to be shock for many of the British public over Prime Minister Ted Heath. Well, can we just add a bit to that slide, Mike, if you will? There we go. Let's bring in the UK column wiring diagram, as we like to call it, where we said, isn't it remarkable that nobody knew that Savile was a paedophile? So here is Jimmy Savile alongside Ted Heath, but the Queen's security detail didn't know, Margaret Thatcher's security detail didn't know, the police in general didn't know, the NHS didn't know, Tony Blair didn't know, Gordon Brown didn't know, so nobody knew that Savile was a paedophile. Well, now we know differently, but at the moment, of course, outrageous to suggest that Edward Heath was also a paedophile. Well, the Independent goes in a particularly interesting direction. Here we are, Edward Heath child sex abuse claims, 5 things you need to know about the allegations. Well, I'm just going to do three of them here. We've got the brothel owner, which of course has been covered in the Mail. Heath was part of a VIP child abuse group around Westminster in the 1960s and 70s. And number three, that Heath had connections to Jersey child abuse. So you start off in this article by apparently being guided through these terrible allegations about Edward Heath, but let's see how it develops from there. This is the next part of it. We've labelled it Supposition, Confusion and Suggestion, how the Independent nudges the public mind away from the reality of a Westminster paedophile ring. So there are a number of statements in this article. We've got unsubstantiated wild allegations on the internet, including that he was being blackmailed by foreign powers. And I'll add to that, they are saying, well, it's outrageous suggestion that he was being blackmailed to take the United Kingdom into the European Union. We've got police investigations, it says, but then the paper says, well, don't read too much into this. All historical allegations will be forensically examined. At least one fantasist, other claims are all hearsay. So if you read through a particular paragraph in the Independent report, it is taking people's minds from one state to the other and back again pretty rapidly. It's telling you there are police investigations, then it tells you don't read too much into that. Then it says it's all historical allegations, but they are being forensically examined. And then it ends again here on at least one fantasist and other claims hearsay.
Is that a coincidence, this word fantasist?
Well, it seems to be the in word because, of course, as I'm sure you're intimating, Mike, this was used for Ben Fellows, and suddenly we've got the fantasist word being used in relation to charges against Edward Heath. What is actually going on with this? We're saying it's nudging. This is applied psychology, we think, by the paper, which is destabilising the public mind. But it goes on. It says publicity can elicit genuine and false allegations. And then they say, well, basically, this is a terribly difficult job for the police to separate. So if we publicise it, all sorts of things come forward, and our poor stretched police are just really not up to the job of seeing what's truthful and what's not. Then they say just because Heath is being investigated, it doesn't mean he's guilty, or indeed it'll stand up in court. So a nice little bit of undermining there, even if victims come forward with their testimonies, doesn't mean it's going to stand up in court. Well, of course not independent, because the courts are corrupt and designed to protect paedophiles in the establishment. And then we get this one. It is certainly far-fetched to suggest that Sir Edward was abusing children in Downing Street or as the Prime Minister because of his security detail. It's far-fetched, according to the Independent. So we don't know how they make that judgment, because there's plenty of evidence out there to talk about paedophiles and perverts working within the British Parliament. But according to the Independent, if you think it, well, that's pretty far-fetched. And we'll give you number 6. It's hard to see how they, the security services, would have been relaxed about a politician having an unhealthy interest in young boys. What a bizarre statement, because it's been widely reported in the British press that the security services were only too happy to watch the abuse of young boys going on by members of the political establishment. All they were concerned about is the damage it could do to the reputation of the country. So presumably independent journalists don't even bother to read some of their colleagues' reports in the mainstream press. But what's that article done? Well, it's already started to create uncertainty in the public mind. This is all a bit of stuff and nonsense, all theory and fantasy on the internet. And of course, this man could never have done this. All of the information we see, and indeed many other informed people over the internet shows that there is a wealth of evidence to say this man was a practicing paedophile. And of course, there are very informative links to say that this was indeed allowing blackmail by foreign powers. Interesting to note that Michael Shrimpton, at present, is in prison. He was put into prison due to his comments about potential bomb scares, but a large part of Michael Shrimpton's work had been to expose the perverted nature of Ted Heath, and indeed blackmail from overseas security services, including from Germany. We can't deal with prime ministers and senior politicians. Let's just remind ourselves what the British state under Blair, Brown or Cameron does to whistleblowers of child abuse. And we just say, have a look at all the people who successfully ganged up to put whistleblower Melanie Shaw in prison. Really powerful people, no trouble to get her in prison at all, and no problem for the Crown Prosecution Service under Saunders to cook up the necessary evidence. So this is the reality of UK. We can't investigate paedophile rings through government, through our own prime ministers, but we can put the victims in prison. And where is this ideology coming from? Well, at the moment, quite clearly, it's David Cameron. No apologies for bringing this slide up again. This is Cameron talking about the need to tackle extremism in the country, but he talks about our values. Those are his values, the Conservative Party's values. And we said yesterday that those values were lies, suppression of free speech, blind eye to child abuse, especially in Westminster, treason, selling off public assets, betrayal of the armed forces, undermining the NHS, attacks on Christianity, sexualisation of our children, unlawful overseas wars, and participation in torture. And we stand by those accusations. And of course, we say that if this is the true morality of David Cameron's Tory party, covering up child abuse would be child's play. Well, thanks to the BBC, let's remind our viewers once again, the BBC happily put on video Tim Fortescue, the Conservative whip, 1970 to 73, saying very clearly to camera, it might be a scandal involving small boys. Anything, they, members of Parliament, would come and ask if we, the whips, might help. And of course, that being the case, it's impossible to say that the government didn't know about the abuse of children. Of course they knew, they were participating in it, and they were covering it up. We better bring him back on screen because, of course, this is the man, British Prime Minister David Cameron, who a few months ago was doing his level best to dismiss any claims of historical child sex abuse, or indeed current child sex abuse in and around Westminster. What he was actually saying was move on to the unwashed masses. That's us. Nothing to see. No child abuse crime amongst the Westminster political establishment. So we've got this unfolding in front of our very eyes. And of course, remember that David Cameron is the man making decisions about everything from education to public services to the NHS to overseas wars. Not to be trusted on children, not to be trusted on anything else. And this one was quite interesting here. An earlier report by the Daily Mail. Ted Heath raped me when I was 12. Former Prime Minister accused of attacking a boy in 1961. And it's also claimed that police dropped the case against the brothel madam. That's the lady we've mentioned earlier. And this particular article is doubly interesting because it had this in it, which was that a US reporter, Lee McGrath Goodman, was in Jersey. She started to get wind of accusations against Ted Heath, and she was kicked out of Britain. But of course, the border agency have said, oh, no, nothing to do with Mr. Heath. It was to do with other matters that we required her to leave. Well, we'll remind people once again, David Cameron, of course, was the man that wanted to sweep everything to do with child abuse under the carpet. And we're going to end the initial part of our news today on that particular report. We'll leave our viewers to think that if we can't trust the British government over child abuse, indeed they are part of the paedophile rings, then need we focus on anything else? And at this point, Mike's going to give an introduction to an interview he did yesterday with Mark Anderson of American Free Press.
I just interviewed Mark late yesterday evening, just before we did the Crane Report last night, and we began by talking about what's going on in Texas with Jade Helm, and perhaps this isn't quite what you've heard before on this subject. So if we get that queued up, here we go. And this interview lasts about 30 minutes or so. Okay, so once again, we welcome Mark Anderson to the program from American Free Press. Welcome, Mark. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, great to be back, Mike.
So what's of interest to you at the moment? You're in Texas at the moment watching Jade Helm, is that correct?
Yeah, Texas was cited or referred to as the most intensely used state, or occupied state, if you want to use that word, for this ambiguous exercise called Jade Helm by the U.S. military concerning some 8 or 9 states. And I'm sure you'll be showing on the screen an article that AFP, American Free Press, just ran about this. Jade Helm 15, AFP on the scene of what's being called a massive military exercise in Texas, but of course other states, including Mississippi and Arizona and others. And as I said, it's ambiguous. It's a little bit of a hard read, but what I did is I worked with a videographer, Ron Avery of Texas, a friend of AFP, and we went town to town and talked to some civil authorities and townsfolk. And we got a mixture of views, but the civil authorities were more than just mute. They went out of their way to tell us just how much they were not going to tell us, which was kind of ironically funny in its own way. One lady representing a sheriff in Bastrop, Texas, Bastrop County, went on and on about what she wasn't going to tell me. They were very guarded, almost paranoid about it, reactionary, if you will. And it's not as if they were just going to say, well, we understand it's a mild or harmless military exercise, and we don't have any comment apart from we're keeping an eye on things. They didn't even say that. It was a fretting kind of reaction. We don't have anything to say. We have no comment. We don't have anything to say, and we have no comment. And I said to the lady in Bastrop, I said, for not having anything to say, you sure are saying a lot.
So, I mean, this is an interesting situation, Mark, because you have the situation where this is an event which has had a lot of hype on the internet over the last several months.
Right.
But you're calling it ambiguous, and people are being vague, or they're being guarded, or they're being secretive about what it is. And so the question in my mind is, the people that have been hyping this up for the last lot of months, have they got a point, or is there some kind of psychological game being played here on the alternative media and so on? Or what is actually going on behind the scenes with this?
Mike, you ask a very good question, and the honest answer is it's hard to nail down perfectly. As I noted, civil authorities are being beyond mute. They're being absolutely, positively quiet and saying nothing about this, and even being a little mean-spirited about it when they decline to comment. And you've got citizens like Tom Draper, who lives in Central Texas there, who's quoted in my article saying the very fact that it's ambiguous, the very fact that civil authorities aren't talking about it, and the military is giving out such vague press releases, all these things, all this ambiguity is precisely what concerns that citizen and some others that we talk to. And yet other citizens, I'm just summarizing here, are not worried, or maybe they haven't heard of Jade Helm. But I think, as we'll show in this broadcast today, there are larger issues to look at which appear to be related, at least conceptually, to Jade Helm, and yet transcend Jade Helm, that I believe are the real concerns. And the alternative media could be played this. It's not that Jade Helm isn't real. It's not that there aren't causes for concern like all the secrecy, but you could still give the alternative media, if you want to call it that, you could still throw them a bone and have them kind of fight over it and have everyone cook up theories that's just it, too theoretical, not based enough in fact. So there's a lot of secrecy surrounding it. I'm still looking into it. I'm still talking to civil authorities here in Texas. But I think that the Pentagon's research going on right now, to the extent that it's related to Jade Helm at all, is really what we need to look at to understand the bigger picture of what the U.S. military, the largest military in history, is up to.
So this is another question. I mean, is this a military exercise, or is it a social engineering experiment?
I think it's a little bit of both. With the U.S. military trying to be the comprehensive global cop, you have to have both elements. And I'll mention briefly that in the article that I wrote, it mentions the concepts that you're about to show on this Pentagon study of the Pentagon, written by Roberto Gonzalez, a San Jose State University professor who I'm in touch with right now.
So this is the Seeing into Hearts and Minds document?
Yeah, Seeing into Hearts and Minds. I generally refer to these concepts, although I don't refer to him by name in the AFP article that you just showed, because it was a little too soon to do that at the time that I wrote that article. But since then, I've had a little correspondence with the professor. And I think that with Jade Helm, this is what we're ultimately looking at, even if Jade Helm is only tangentially or thinly or loosely related to this study of what the Pentagon's up to. And basically, this is the social radar, seeing into hearts and minds. Let those words sink in a minute. Seeing into hearts and minds. That is something that's very invasive conceptually, seeking to look at human beings from the inside out. And this implies a great deal of a coordination of surveillance and data gathering and so on, and putting all this into a big database. And as you see on this page in this article, they refer to the social radar. And they use social media, they use demographics, they use political beliefs, polling, and letters to the editor in newspapers, for all we know. And they comprise profiles of different countries or regions of countries or cities or states or what have you. And therefore, warfare becomes far more than just bombs and bullets. It becomes mastering the human domain. Now, that's the subtitle that's most closely associated with Jade Helm, this military exercise, mastering the human domain. And to do that, you have to do what Professor Gonzalez is talking about in his overview of what the Pentagon's up to here. You have to see into hearts and minds. You have to survey the minutia, the fine details of human existence, people's customs, their beliefs, what they eat, what they read, what they buy commercially. And you put that all together to profile a given place, and then you determine, is that place an adversary? Are they friendly, or is it a mixed bag? Now, some of this is just the Pentagon spending the over $600 billion a year that it wrings from U.S. taxpayers and gives to defense contractors and universities, and they've got to produce something for all that money. So some of this is probably just fluff to spend government money. But if you read Professor Gonzalez's article here, it goes into great detail about what the military's up to in the manner that I just explained. So Jade Helm would appear to be at least loosely related to this, and this makes it a more important article than just arguing about whether Jade Helm is physically a threat in the immediate sense to people in Texas or anywhere else in the United States, because then you get into so much speculation that you go off the charts. But naturally, it should be watched, because right now, as I mentioned in my article from AFP, the U.S. is also training right in Ukraine on the Russian border. So there's always that chance that Jade Helm is related to our overseas training to confront Russia, and they just want to explore different physical terrains throughout the country for that training. So Jade Helm may or may not be a direct threat to Americans, but a war with Russia would be a direct threat to all peoples.
Well, absolutely right, Mark. But I suspect part of this, you're seeing quite similar kinds of trends of activity with the authorities in the States as we have here. We are constantly being treated like lab rats or mice, perhaps is a better analogy in many ways, looking at our behaviour and putting stories in the media and looking at what reaction that we get. The British government has just announced huge contracts for private companies to start assessing social media, looking for keywords, specifically government-related keywords, specifically critical keywords, sentences and keywords that are critical of the government, and then tracking the people that are making those statements and those comments. We just see this constant sort of push of stories into the media, and then carefully looking at the reaction. And actually, even just simply commenting on newspaper websites underneath the stories. There's always the comments that are there, and these comments are being carefully watched. And actually, if you look at the broader picture, you've got many websites these days using commenting platforms like Discuss, where in fact your comments are tracked right across multiple websites, and therefore they get a much better picture of what your views actually are. But if you think back to the last time we met physically, Mark, in 2013, the big data agenda was absolutely well and truly on the list, the agenda items for the Bilderberg Group meeting in Watford, and we're starting to see this agenda play out already.
Yeah, there's a lot of cyber topics and artificial intelligence popping up on Bilderberg agendas over the last couple of years. You're absolutely right, Mike. And to accent what you just said, Mike, that surveillance based on keywords and social media, whatnot, in the UK and in that area is not dissimilar to what the professor is describing into seeing into hearts and minds, although what the Pentagon is looking at is a more broad, tactical, comprehensive thing. But it seems to me that it would have to include what you're talking about, and that is to surveil people's beliefs based on keywords, based on what they've written in letters to the editor, in guest commentaries, blogs, emails, if they delve that deep, if they get that, that much into a spying mode. So, this is all related, I believe, to track so-called extremists and at some point declare them the enemy, although the real extremists are the nation states or the transnationalists like Bilderberg that command the money, command the bombs, command the bullets, command the badges, those that wear a badge. The real extremists are those with absolute power in their hands, and they want to call everyone else extremists, those of us that get by on very minor pay and just go about our daily business with our lives and our families. So we know who the real extremists are, and this is why they've got to call someone else what they are. That's a common psychological tactic, accuse everyone else, that is, of the very things that you are doing. And that's exactly what the governments are up to.
Indeed. So Jade Helm is still running, is it? Or when does it end?
It ends around September 15th, and I'm not done yet. This is something that requires repeated phone calls, inquiries, a little bit of travel here and there. I did not physically see much in the way of military personnel on the ground, except for the photo in that Jade Helm AFP article that you posted a few minutes ago, where I saw a sizable Texas National Guard unit along the road in Blanco, Texas, just southeast of Abilene. I'm getting the location right. It's Highway 183, southeast of Abilene, northwest of Austin. And that was around July 16th. That was the day after Jade Helm started. It was the American Free Press article where it shows that unit, not the one I'm seeing on the screen. But they had some, there it is. They have some large earth-moving equipment, very large, some of the largest front-end loaders I've ever seen. Now, that doesn't mean anything. I'm not going to read anything into that. But it was the most military people I've seen in one spot since I've lived in Texas part-time over the last 7 or 8 years. Again, I won't draw harsh conclusions from that, those soldiers told me they were strictly with the Texas National Guard and not under the Northern Command and not part of Jade Helm, that they were state soldiers under the authority of the governor. And so, nevertheless, there is a little bit more activity, but I didn't see a lot more on the ground military activity physically. But we can all be a little smarter, I think, in this newscast, Mike. That's what we're saying. We don't need to get caught up in the he said, she said, is Jade Helm a threat or not in the immediate sense. We can look deeper at what the Pentagon's doing, seeing into hearts and minds, look at their military tactics, their information and studying and research into artificial intelligence and everything else they're doing, and be a little smarter about this and not get caught up in any unnecessary propaganda that might be planted for us so they can discredit us later. That does happen from time to time.
Indeed. Nonetheless, that is some pretty impressive kit in that photograph. So, I mean, what was their intention with that? What were they intending to use that for?
Oh, the equipment?
Yeah.
Well, they wouldn't really say. I didn't get much of a chance to talk to them. If you look even slightly curious, they get kind of reticent and sort of standoffish. There was one lady soldier that I talked to. It's usually better to talk to someone in isolation than in a group. That's just kind of a reporter's thing, because then they'll tell you more typically because others aren't listening in on them when they're talking to you. And I don't know is the honest answer, but it was some large earth-moving equipment, that's for sure. And as I say, this thing goes till September 15th, and I'm not done looking yet at the immediate on-the-ground stuff. But in the meantime, we can think about these tactical plans and long-range schemes that the Pentagon is doing to see into hearts and minds. And that's the real meat of this, above and beyond daily military maneuvers. But we have to keep in mind that whatever Jade Helm is, the U.S. military is doing things that are really more of an immediate threat, arguably, on the Ukraine border. Actually, that exercise, which is mentioned in the article, what's it called? Bear with me a moment. That exercise, Rapid Trident. There we go, Rapid Trident. That just actually concluded. So, we don't want to get all focused on Jade Helm and forget about the fact that the U.S. military is doing stuff all over the world, and the stuff near the Russian border is definitely the most notable.
Well, indeed. And actually, when did you say Jade Helm was finishing?
September 15th, according to the military.
So September 15th leads them directly into the time scale for the next big NATO exercise, which is taking place in Spain, Portugal and Italy, and I think that begins, at least the initial work on that begins just around that time, the end of September, last 2 weeks of September, and the main exercises are for October and November. They're going to be they're going to be looking at 36,000 personnel taking part in that. Now, of course, that's in Cold War terms, that's not massive. But post-Cold War, that's the biggest, certainly the biggest deployment of NATO personnel since 2002, I think, or even possibly even longer than that. That's Jade Helm finishes that exercise more or less begins straight away, and that's going to be not just NATO personnel, but so-called ally personnel and others as well, including the Ukraine. So while the main focus of the activity is in the Mediterranean, there will be other nations involved. Pretty big event coming up. But what was fascinating to me, and we're going to show this this video clip. Can't do it now during our conversation, Mark, but in the news when we at the same time we play out this interview with you, we will play out this video. NATO has produced a little promo video for this thing, and to be honest, we just don't really get who this promo video is for, because it's quite corporate and quite Hollywood in its presentation style, and we're not really, again, it's a bit like Jade Helm in this respect. We're not really certain what the purpose of this exercise is. Is it a genuine military exercise, or is it some kind of propaganda that's designed to produce some kind of response in the population, a fear response, or maybe something else? There's just a lot of PR around around this September, October, November NATO exercise, which has shades very similar to what's going on with Jade Helm. It's very interesting.
That is interesting, Mike. You make an excellent point, and I think that rounds out our discussion quite well on this topic. Yeah, the timing, and Jade Helm might simply be the U.S. component of these anti-Russian NATO expansionist toward the east exercises, for all we know. And my educated guess is that's at least part of what this is about.
Yeah.
There can be other elements. The military likes to kill 3 or 4 birds with one stone in terms of the U.S. But really, what we need to look at is the big picture primarily, the policy toward Russia, the Pentagon tactical plans like seeing into hearts and minds, these high-tech futuristic plans. And this is the real news. And we're not going to fall into anybody's trap. And that includes right here, right now, today in this interview. So the authorities out there, and all I can say to them is nice try.
Yes. Okay, very good. So what else is going on in the United States? Obviously, we mentioned this on Monday's news program, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, their meeting broke up just before the weekend, or at the weekend, in Hawaii with no agreement. So where do you see that going in the next few months?
Well, with the presidential elections heating up, you can't say precisely where things are going, but you can generally say that these elections and their campaigns for countless Republican would-be nominees and the would-be Democrat or shoe-in Democrat Hillary Clinton, God save us all. These campaigns are heating up now. They're going to heat up more. That can make the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Deal, more of a topic of the campaigns, which will bring some contention. And we've already been bought some time by the Hawaii talks breaking up with not much to show for them. So now that the TPP could become, rather than a quiet thing happening on the side, now that it could become a campaign issue, a bone of contention, then that's going to, I believe, hobble it even more. And buying time, no matter what you might think of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, buying time is very important. But I'll just add that an Australian writer, based on a link that I received recently, noted that according to a WikiLeaks leak and other sources, it appears to be possible that under the TPP, the very idea of a public sector could come under attack, meaning that the corporations are almost trying to eliminate the public sector altogether in these wild privatization schemes where they privatize everything that's not nailed down and even privatize things that are nailed down. I mean, anything you might think of as a state-owned enterprise could become privatized if we're seeing this right, if we're understanding this right, under the TPP, unless it's altered, or preferably, some would say, unless it's just defeated altogether.
Well, to be honest, I don't know how it is in the States, but George Osborne had his so-called emergency summer budget just after they were elected. So it was 5-6 weeks ago now. And in the middle of that budget speech, he discussed how this year was going to be the largest privatization of state assets since 1986.
There you go.
And so that process has begun, aside from the actual free trade agreements that are in negotiation at the moment. So it's what's staggering, Mark, is that Greece is having to sell off a host of national assets as a result of the draconian fascist terms of this new deal that they've been given. But frankly, Britain is selling off assets faster than Greece is, and there is no such pressure on Britain, on the British government. So there's clearly been a policy decision made to the privatization of everything. As you say, if it isn't nailed down, it's going, and it's pretty incredible how fast it's going as well.
That's fascinating that Britain is selling it off faster than Greece, even though Britain is not under the gun like Greece is. That's very interesting. That's a huge story. If that's not in the UK column already, that should be a big headline. That's very adroit of you, Mike, and astute to point that out. It's clearly a goal. Britain's doing it, Greece is doing it. So then the TPP would internationalize that process. Apparently, if we're reading this right.
Yeah,
it's a little tentative to make a final judgment right now. I want to point that out. But that seems to be the direction the arrows are pointing here. that the TPP would formalize and internationalize the idea that state-owned enterprises is a dinosaur concept, that should go the way of the Edsel and be eliminated. And although I'm not for major state control in government, it's not true that corporate and private control of every facet of society makes society better. It's not true that privatization always makes things cheaper and better. That is a huge myth.
Yeah.
And, you really got to go kind of on a case-by-case basis as to whether a given enterprise should be state-owned or partially state-owned or state-funded, and look at what kind of enterprise it is. To make these blanket decisions and blanket policies like this is just bad policy.
And of course, the argument is always nationalize or privatize, as if there's only two options. But of course, the other option is to own the asset and perhaps contract out the running of it. There are other ways of doing this that are somewhere in between the two, which you might find a better balance. But
exactly,
one or the other is always the way that it goes. Just look, we're running out of time, Mark. So just before we go, give us Hillary's. I understand that Hillary's campaign is kind of running a bit flat at the moment. Is that the case? And what is happening with the presidential campaign in general?
Well, I've been busy with Jade Helm and the TPP and Bilderberg and whatnot. I haven't had a real close eye on that. Hillary's still getting pummeled now and then about destroyed emails and all the secrecy and lack of transparency in her own life and candidacy. Hopefully that will grow. We don't need another Clinton any more than we need another Bush. Here we don't have monarchies like you do, but we still have a dynasty, the Bushes and the Clintons. So anybody that believes America is free of dynastic successions from, generation to generation filling the same office, if they think we're free of that, they better think again, because we are not free of it. Hillary Clinton represents the old guard, the old worn-out internationalist guard. She's simply the Democratic left wing of the New World Order, just like Bush is the neoconservative right wing of the Bilderberg trilateral system. We don't need either one of them. Hillary should be asked about the death of Vince Foster and other things, very, very serious things that happened when her husband was president. But the U.S. media will not go below, say, the year 2002. It's as if Hillary's life prior to 2002, 2003 doesn't even exist. They will not look at her life prior to those years. It's the strangest thing I've ever seen.
Yeah. So you'll be voting for Donald Trump then?
If I vote at all, voting has become kind of an exercise in futility, because you're voting for people that don't take direction from the people anyway. So once you elect them, they go and do what they want anyway. America lacks any real mechanism to have a say-so for the average person in the government. But Donald Trump is a colorful figure. I'll grant him that. And he's got some interesting things to say. At least he'll say them. And he's not so bogged down by political correctness. He's willing to at least speak his mind a little bit, and that's a start. So we'll see what happens. We'll talk about the presidential thing more in our next broadcast.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much for joining us once again. And hopefully we'll see you next week, maybe.
Yeah, sounds good. We'll try and make it work, Mike. Have a good one.